Hey there, I'm Ryan, and this is the very first episode of the Dreyer Drive podcast, a podcast all about siblings and the people, places, and pop culture that raised us. It's hosted by me, Ryan, and my younger sister, Jacqueline. And in today's episode, you'll learn a little bit more about why we decided to start a podcast and why we decided to start one now. And you'll also learn about some siblings whose entitlement and rivalry literally ended an entire dynasty. Let's check it out. Welcome to Dreyer Drive, a podcast about siblings and the people, places, and pop culture that raised us. I'm here today with my very junior co-host and sidekick, Jacqueline, who is my little sister. And while I'm joking that she's my podcast co-host, she's not really. This is our 50-50
To be fair, I have
split.
Andy Richter energy, so it's fine.
What is Andy Richter energy? Just for the record.
I don't know,
just in
like,
case. So when Andy Richter himself comes and listens to this, he knows how you feel about him.
I expect he will, in fact, be a guest. Does Andy Richter have siblings, though?
Well, that's the main component of this podcast. Sorry, Andy, if you don't have
we could
siblings.
just Google it. I did some research. Surprise. No, I don't know anything about Andy Richter.
So, this is mainly for the one person who's listening to this now, meaning as it comes out, and to the, I don't know, million roughly fans who are going to come back and listen to this as this grows in popularity through its course in history.
Estimate.
Yeah, I think it's on the low side. But really, I think
the one's the low estimate.
Yes. I think a good place to start is really like maybe not even introductions on ourselves to begin. I think that'll kind of like come out as we go through these stories and as we go through the conversation. But I think really like starting with like, first of all, what is a Dreyer Drive, right? What is Dreyer Drive? And even like how you and I decided that it was time to like throw our hat in the ring of the world of podcasts. Because like I think there are I think there are so many podcasts that the exaggerated number of podcasts isn't large enough to exaggerate that. Yeah, when you're like there are like a million podcasts and someone's like, actually there's 2.36. Like the large
like
number
7 people in my neighborhood that have one.
Really?
No.
Right, there's 6. There actually
I live in a town of 4,000.
That was not a good exaggeration. When your exaggerated number is 7, we just went from a million to 7, and that's not enough.
Okay, one of us is a dreamer, and one of us is a realist. You can guess which is which. Okay, well, I was actually just talking to my kids and husband about this, because they were like, why are you doing this? And I was like, honestly, Ryan and I probably talk 3 hours a week anyway. We might as well do something productive with that time, because right now it's just me folding laundry and you talking to your daughter Noah at the same time. So I feel like at least this way we're doing it without interruptions, right? It's 3 hours of uninterrupted time.
I thought like it would be a good way to just also avoid the rest of the family, where it's like, what's going on? Listen to the podcast. Did you listen to the pod? Like that's really it. Just like forward it to every family member, and then everybody knows what we've talked about and where everybody is with their understanding of the current situation of the entire family.
Yeah, and this is a complete aside, but we've talked about before, with a bigger family, the alliances in a big family change overnight. So like we're an alliance right now. This might not be forever. I might make an alliance with one of our other brothers. So I'm just saying, tread carefully. This could be short term.
One day it'll be a different brother here. It'll be I'm gone, and it'll just be somebody else. It'll be Dad. Dad just trying to figure out. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Which also for those
only from the chin angle.
From the chin. It's just the bottom part of his goatee. So you already kind of alluded to it, but like obviously we know how big our family is. Like I think it's a big family, but I think we could probably also talk about that and then go back into. So 5 siblings, right? There are 5 of us, and then of course we've got 2 parents and 7 total. There's a million pets in the mix, and now there's extended family.
And I'm the only daughter, I would like to point out. So that's important.
Yeah. So
I feel.
So mom,
for me,
dad,
it's important.
male, female, male. right? So brother, brother, sister, brother, brother, for those of you who can't do that conversion. But yeah, so, and we're all roughly 2 years apart. So Dan and I,
we're in a
my
10-year
older brother,
span
Dan,
for all of us.
a much better way to say that. I think people can expect from this podcast is some stories about us and how we were raised and where we were raised and how that kind of formed who we were. But in every episode, what we're going to do is one of us, it'll mostly be you, will introduce some siblings from history, mostly non-fictional, but potentially fictional siblings as well. And we're just going to talk a little bit about what raised them, who raised them, how they were raised, and maybe what they achieved or didn't achieve through their raising, through their upbringing. Hey,
there we go.
We got a thesaurus over here. So if you look at the spelling of this podcast title and the street that we grew up on, that's the title, right? Dreyer Drive. I catch Dad saying Dreyer Drive, and I feel
like he did that. Our dad is a very sweet man, and sometimes I think he did that just to make other people feel better. Like when they said it wrong, like that's something that Dad would do, or like tell someone that's the road it is, and he's saying it phonetically because he wants them to see the sign and realize that it's spelled like Dreyer. So we could ask Dad. He would tell us the truth, but I honestly think that might have just been like a dadism to make other people feel good about themselves.
It's really one of the greatest things. Dad has a lot of great qualities, but I think the way that he normalizes like failure, like he goes out of his way to like, I know one time when I was renovating my house, when I was still living in Canada, for those who don't know, meaning all of you, I now live in Okinawa, Japan, but when I lived on the east coast of Canada, bought a house fully renovated. It's going to be in every episode. The Japan, in case you guys didn't know, I live in Japan.
In case you didn't know and no one ever asks, I am living in Utah.
In a gingerbread house. Currently recording in your laundry room, which is amazing. We'll look back on the humble beginnings.
Smells like bounce suits in
but,
here.
It's the main reason. This is the main reason why I chose this room. Dad, so I was renovating the house, and like I was doing it by myself with Dad, and the days that he couldn't come and help, I would just still go at it. And I remember one day I decided I would tackle hanging the doors. And I spent the day. Hanging doors is annoying, especially by yourself. You know, they were brand new doors. You got to cut the holes for the doorknobs and the lock set and all that fun stuff. And I got it all done. And I FaceTimed Dad to do like the childhood brag that I still do to this day. And I was like, Dad, like I worked really hard. I'm like, look how I hung the doors, and I showed him. He's like, oh, it looks really good. He's like, I think they might be hung upside down. And I take a look, and surely the door was hung upside down. And it sounds like a simple fix. No, you just flip it around. But no, because the hinges and the doorknob of where it's placed. So unless you wanted to open it the opposite way and you're reaching way up in the sky to twist the doorknob. And then he, like, without missing a beat, he's like, oh, I can't count the amount of times I've done that. I'm like, really? You cannot count the amount of times that you have hung a door upside down?
Because the number is zero, and you technically can't count zero.
Yes, he's just totally normalizing the failure of hanging doors upside down. We ended up flipping it to another room, and it was fine. But just the way that Dad was like, oh, I can't count the amount of times that I've hung a door upside down. That you've never done that, but thank you, bless you for doing that, or for saying that, because now it made me feel less like punching a hole through the door that I've just hung. But yeah, so that's Dad.
And sadly, that I don't think that trait has been passed down to any of his children. So it goes with him.
What are you doing? What are you doing? That's wrong. What are you doing? That's
you did
wrong.
It that
and
way?
In fact, then the amount of joy that every single one of us takes in pointing out that somebody else is doing something wrong. So yeah, Dad,
get on a group phone call.
Yeah, that stops with you, Dad. That stops with you. So the podcast is called Dreyer Drive, or Dreyer Drive, if you're my dad explaining it to other people. And it's the name of the street that we were raised on. And I think that there is a lot that kind of happened on that street. There are a lot of characters. It's where, you know, we experienced the first 18, 19, 20 years of our lives. And that goes for all five of us. Yeah, so I think that that's some important information that people need to know. I also think that, like, the temptation is to just spew out like every name and every like landmark in the town of Ajax, Ontario in Canada where we grew up. And like just say all of the names. But I think obviously they're going to have to kind of like slowly unfold. But I think it makes sense to at least introduce the names of the seven of us, so that people as they're listening to the podcast will understand, oh, this person is the older brother, or this person is the younger brother, or whatever.
Yes, and can we also make sure that we say everybody's age, not because you guys are older than me, first of all, but also because I need people to understand like the time period that this is happening in. Like being kids in the 90s was a experience, and you have to understand like what time period this is all happening as well. Okay, so our oldest brother is Daniel. He was born in 1980. Then you are the next oldest, and you were born in 82. As previously mentioned heavily, you live in Okinawa. I say it really fast because I am not confident in my pronunciation. Then I was born in 84, so we're 2 years apart. I live in Utah. Our next brother is Jonathan, who was born in 87. He currently lives in Toronto. And then Dallin, our youngest brother, was born in 90, and he currently lives in Vancouver. So we got a real geographical spread on us.
Yeah.
The house itself, Dreyer Drive, really quick, we did live there our entire adolescent lives. All of us lived there from when we were born until we moved out. It was the first house our parents ever purchased as a married couple, so it went through a lot of phases, and I think that honestly is like an extra character, and that's part of it too, I think. Yeah.
I know you've got something prepared for today, and before we dive into your introduction of the siblings, which I have no idea about, or I have no idea who they're going to be or which period of time they're going to be from, but I did want to ask you one question. It's very much related to what you just mentioned about us living in 26 Dreyer Drive for the majority, right? Like our whole childhood, some of us even into the adult years. But if you had to give 26 Dreyer Drive, Ajax, Ontario, a nickname or like a street moniker or like a single word to describe like what it was or what it means to you and your understanding of the world, like what would you give it?
The only thing that keeps coming to mind when you say that is just the word like communal. And I mean, because everything at Dreyer was a communal space, there was like truly not a single private space at that house. Under the stairs
in the basement bedroom, there was a little
in that little cubby hole.
Yes, a cubby hole.
But like even, I mean, Dreyer Drive as a whole, like this is something that doesn't even exist anymore. This like kids just wandering into other people's houses all the time, your neighbors being like your friend group because they are the closest geographically to that. I just feel like everything about that whole experience and what made me seek private living so much in my adult life was the fact that until I moved out, everything belonged to somebody else or was shared by someone else. I shared a room as the only girl with our youngest brother for the first 8 years of my life. So like there was like we didn't have any, we had shared one bathroom between all 7 of us. Like that is shocking to me now in the year of our Lord 2024 to think that like that was the way things were is crazy to me. But yeah, so that's what it was just everything about it was extremely communal.
My turn.
Yeah. Yours is going to be funnier than mine.
Basically I was waiting the whole time for you just so I could jump in and say mine because I prepared in advance. I don't know if you do this, but I find it hard to like separate the days on Dreyer Drive. Like everything it's just one really long day. Like I can't, whether it's Dan spray painting the side of the house, and of course I'm sure that story will come up, but like whether it's the day that Dan spray painted the side of the house or kicked a soccer ball through the front window, or Taylor, one of our childhood dogs, jumping over the fence and attacking another dog, or like just us building the deck or the treehouse, like all of it is just one really long day. I don't separate it as like, well, this was one day and this was another day. It's just one really long day. And when I think about it that way, I think the way that I would describe it is like chaos, but spelled with a K and a heart for the O. If we're putting it on like a face tattoo, it would be like, it was chaotic. Yeah, which I will after this. It was chaotic, but there was love in that house. There was like a warmth to it some of the time.
Word, I mean, we've talked about this before. The word we always say, like, it was a net positive, right? So whatever we say about like Dreyer Drive in general is that I do believe everything about it was a net positive. There were some crazy things that happened. There were, but overall it was a positive experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's the heart, right in the middle of the chaos, spelled with the K without the H. So that's how I would describe it. And it's K.
That was a bridge too far. I was with you until you left the H out. I'm like, absolutely.
And the S is a dollar sign. The S is a dollar sign also. Anyway, with that being said, I know that's a long ramble about kind of like why now, why us, why the name, who we are, but hopefully through the lifespan of this podcast, people can, one, identify with that, because I think that's the other thing. Although we definitely believe that we're special because it's a mental issue with all of us that we believe we're the main character of every story, I think there's a lot of like, oh yeah, that happened to me, or oh yeah, that happened to us, because I think there was just kind of like a communal upbringing where we all kind of identify. And I hope that's what people can get out of this podcast. And especially as we look at like other siblings too, to realize that like, oh, that also happened in the 1600s, or that also happened in Nepal. Like there's this kind of like shared experience for any siblings growing up in any time period, in any culture / pop culture. Poop culture. With a U with the two dots above it.
It's about dogs.
Yes, it's about dogs. But anyways, I will be quiet now because this is your time to shine. I know that you've prepared something and that you're ready to blow my mind with a story about some siblings in history.
Before I start, I will say that I research a lot for my day job. And so like nothing really gets me going like a good little research project. And so I do need to show, I know this is an audio medium, but if this is on the video, I do want to show my notes because I do take written notes even in my day job. I don't take computer notes because for some reason I feel like I process it while I'm writing it down. And so this had to be done. And so, let me
describe this for people who are listening to this. We have a spiral bound children's notebook that you would receive, and there are multiple pages with handwritten notes about,
with the most chaotic with a K notes.
With a dollar sign S and heart O. But my real question for you is, in the margins, have you written slow down?
We used to often have to give speeches, which is a really interesting
public
part
presentations.
Of our upbringing. I think probably more than the average family, we were urged to speak in public a lot. And anytime we had to speak in public, we would write our own speeches, and our dad would then go through them and write slow down all through the margins because we all talk really fast, and he was worried that people couldn't understand us.
So we were raised amongst Toastmasters. It was a Toastmasters group. 26 Dreyer was also a weekly
Toastmasters and improv groups. Yes,
okay.
And? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so get into your small novel that you...
I'm really excited about this because I have a Jeopardy type knowledge where I understand things broadly but not deeply. And so I did get to delve deeper into something that I found very interesting for a long time. I knew about these people. I'm getting more into understanding them, and then I also have listened to a lot of podcasts about them. So, the siblings, introducing you to the Plantagenet brothers.
Now, I'm sorry, is that their name?
The Plantagenet, their last name is Plantagenet, yes. So the Plantagenet brothers are the last of a dynasty. The Plantagenets ruled England, I believe, from mid-1100s, and they ended the dynasty in the late 1400s, were the Plantagenets. And the reason they ended it was, like, they just could not get along. There were three brothers that were
it wasn't because their school teachers were sick of trying to pronounce their names when they were doing roll call in the morning, and they're like, the Plantagenets?
Like,
The Plantagenets? The Plantagenets?
It's actually where Porter came from, our last name. It was like one of those dumbed down names. When they came to Canada, they just changed it to Porter.
Okay.
No,
sorry.
so the exact dates, Plantagenets ruled from 1154 to 1485. So a really good chunk of time, but they just, like, these three brothers brought the entire dynasty to its knees and brought in one of the biggest dynasties, which was the Tudor dynasty.
So three of them. There are three brothers.
Three brothers. And I want to introduce you to the brothers. There were 12 Plantagenet siblings altogether. Not all of them obviously survived into adulthood, and the three brothers were the last surviving brothers, and they were Edward, who I want to say is like a Chris Hemsworth. I think of him as like beefy and very capable. Okay. The middle brother is George, and I want to think of him more as like a Bradley Cooper. And then the youngest brother, who is Richard, was said to be small and dark, and I want to think of him as the Timothy Chalamet type. Very slight man.
I don't know who that is. I have no idea who that is.
I'm only 2 years younger than you, first of all. It's actually because I have teenagers.
Gap.
So I know. Yeah, for sure. So everybody listening will know who that is, because I think if you live on Earth, you should know who Timothy Chalamet is.
Oh, cool. So it's me and everybody else.
Okay, get it together. Google a picture while I'm talking. So the thing about Richard as the youngest is because he was the youngest of literally 12 siblings, before he enters the stage, no one really knows anything about him. There was a letter written, and one person was inquiring how Richard was doing, and the letter literally just said, "And Richard yet lives." Like, that's all they had to say with him, about him was like, well, he's still alive. Like, I have nothing to say about Richard. So we have these brothers, and you already start to see kind of oldest, middle, youngest coming into play, because they are the three last brothers. They had a claim to the throne through their father's side. Their father wasn't the King of England, but he was a Duke of York. And when he passed away, Edward decided to take that claim and take it straight to the throne. He won the throne in a battle and becomes the King of England. So now we have new dynamic.
Wait, was he battling other family members? Like, I don't. So you said it was. Did you say it was Thomas or Edward?
Edward is the oldest brother. Yeah.
So Edward is the oldest. Edward is the oldest of the remaining three. Mm-hmm. So that means that 9 siblings before them have lived and died.
Well, they had sisters, but sisters in this time don't really factor into any type of logistics whatsoever, because they couldn't succeed the throne.
So some sisters are still alive, potentially.
Yes.
And then number 9 decides he's up next. He's on deck. Mm-hmm. And goes to battle
the King of England. Their family isn't on the throne currently. They have been in the past, and because they have been in the past, they are descended from the York dynasty, basically, the York family. And so Edward takes that, and he's like, I could be King of England. I have the claim to the throne. My dad's dead. I'm going for it. He goes for it, wins it in a battle, and is now like, cool, I'm the king now.
And we joke about entitlement. Like, I think entitlement is something that's like thrown around for like, today's kids are so entitled. But this is literally with a TCH in the middle, a literal entitlement. Like, they believe they are entitled.
Yes. Well, not only that, the word entitled actually comes from what he's going to do the very next day, which he becomes king the next day. He makes his brothers dukes as well. And with that, he entitles them. George becomes the Duke of Clarence, and I believe Richard becomes the Duke of Gloucester. You might need to check me on that. But basically, money, wealth, land, all the power in the world. They are the royal family now, these three brothers. That's great. George loves it. The middle brother loves it. Richard's loving it. Except when Edward goes and marries a woman named Elizabeth Woodville. The problem with Elizabeth Woodville is a few different things. She's a commoner, which is absolutely not heard of. It was done very suddenly. And the Woodvilles also have like 10 or 11 siblings, and they are a very prolific family. They're not an important family. There's just a lot of them. And as someone from a big family, I also understand that. It's just like when everybody knows your name before you even know them. Like, everybody knows the Woodvilles. George, the middle brother's like, this is ridiculous. Absolutely not. Like, you're marrying this family who aren't even nobles into our, I think they were like middle to lower class nobles, but not
get them out of here.
Yeah.
Lizzie Woodville.
That's what I always say. So George, hearing this, starts to turn on his brother a little bit. He meets up with this man named Warwick, the Earl of Warwick, who is kind of, I would say, a father figure. They called him the Kingmaker.
Sorry, his name is Warwick, and he is the... So hold on. He is...
No, his name is
Warwick, and he's the Lord of Warwick?
That's not exactly how it works, but often in England about this time, if someone is the Earl of something, they would just call them that. So, like, George was often called Clarence because he was the Duke of Clarence. So George spends some time with Warwick, and Warwick is called the Kingmaker, which I wish that was my name. That's such a cool name. But because he put people on the throne, he was always scheming. And so George goes to Warwick.
He wasn't just a photographer at that time that was literally putting people on the throne for an Instagram
and then
photo.
taking the picture. And
putting babies on the throne. He was just he was a baby photographer. He would like wrap them up in those like nice things and put some kind of flower in them. It's the most uncomfortable position. But they're babies and they can be like
really
that.
In a really tight squaddle with the other hand.
That's exactly what they don't feel any pain.
So Warwick was not actually a baby photographer. He was a schemer. And so when George goes to him, Warwick agrees that Elizabeth Woodville is kind of a ridiculous choice. But Warwick has 2 daughters named Isabel and Anne. And Warwick's like, I have a great idea. I marry my daughter Isabel and you'll strengthen your claim on the throne because I'm noble and she's noble. So George does it. He marries Isabel. And now, not that George has moved up any higher in the line, but the fact that he's married someone who is more noble than Elizabeth Woodville, George starts to, with Warwick, drum up support for a revolt against his own brother. So,
oh no.
All during this time, Richard is Team Edward. Like me watching Twilight, Team Edward from the jump. Never have I wavered. So Richard is Team Edward for the most part, but Warwick does talk Richard into also marrying his younger daughter, Anne. So now Warwick has 2 daughters married into this royal family. George and Warwick stage this revolt, and Edward and Richard have to flee. They flee to Flanders, and they live in exile for a couple of years while they're battling this all out. They have a battle. A lot of battles in English history. They have a battle. Edward wins, and not only that, Edward gains a lot of support from the English people at this time. Like, people like Edward. They like what he's doing. So when George and Warwick are trying to stage this revolt, I don't think people were really that into it. So he won pretty easily. He comes back to England. We're all good. For about, I think it was 3 or 4 years, I want to say, everybody sides with Edward.
So when you say, hold on, when you say that they were all good, does this mean that, like, so George stages this revolt, Edward and Richard disappear while the armies are fighting it out, right?
Amassing,
like, you guys got this? You guys got this? We're going to go over here. You guys got this, right?
Let me know how it goes.
So George and Warwick are unsuccessful. And then what, do they just all meet up for Sunday brunch like nothing happens?
Honestly,
That's crazy, right, guys? We tried to. We couldn't do it.
Edward kind of just like decides to forgive George. They're brothers, right? And so while he's like not happy with the way things have gone down, George still retains his lands, still retains his title, and Edward and Elizabeth, for their part, they have 10 kids. And so as they're having more kids, same with now, as they have kids, the brothers are getting bumped down the line of succession, right? Because now Edward, who also has 3 boys, now his sons will inherit before it goes to George. So they're having these kids. George is kind of like embroiled in just being mad all the time because he really thinks he and his wife should be on the throne, and it's just not happening for him. And every time they have another boy, he's just like, absolute nightmare. I hate my nephew so much. Like, boo every time they're born. Like, another one.
I feel like even that, like, so just to take a half a step back, when you're like, it's kind of all good. I think, like, from like a sibling perspective, there are times where, like, maybe even our significant others or people who don't know us, and I think this goes for every sibling, you watch something unfold and you're like, how did they forgive them for doing that? And it could be anything
1000%.
from like when you're a child. Yeah, anything from like when you're a child and you rip off a Barbie doll's head or something like that. Or, you know, invading that person's kingdom and trying to kill them. And people are like, off with his head. And Edward's just like, nah, that's George. He always does stuff like this.
You drew a skull and crossbones across the face of my baby doll Sarah with orange highlighter, and I'm still not over it. And I'd actually like to talk about it.
Well, that's episode 2. That's episode 2. Of this
Episode
podcast.
2 is just, we're just going to talk about everything that we've done wrong to each other.
But I did just want to point out, like, that's the most sibling thing ever, to be like, all right, you tried to kill me. You probably killed a lot of my men. You caused me a ton of harm and set me back. We spent a lot of money on this, but, like, we're good.
Yeah, and I think Richard, as the youngest, plays both sides a little bit. And so he's kind of, like, to me, he's kind of the peacemaker on both sides. I think he, like, when Edward was mad at George, he'd go and be like, George is a nice guy. And when George is mad at Edward, he'd be like, like, Edward's the king of England. So, like, either way, I think the three of them balance each other out a little bit. Unfortunately, 3 years later, George decides he's going to try again. He kind of talks to a different earl and gets him to raise another army. But everybody knows George is funding it. Everybody knows George is the person who's influencing everything. And so he's actually tried for treason. And Edward executes him.
Like, actually. So this time there's no forgiving him.
This time he's like, I can't forgive you because it's happening again. The first time, I'll let it slide. The second time, no.
So you're telling me we're not talking about figurative execution. We're talking about literal execution.
He executes him.
Just to make sure that we can create the boundaries between those two. And
yes.
We're talking about actual and literal execution.
George is 28 at this time, and the rumor going around Plantagenet, England, is that he requested that as his last request that he be executed in a vat of wine. And then the other rumor is that Edward allowed it, as his last, brotherly act was okay, you're not going to be drawn and quartered. You're not going to be beheaded. I will allow you to be drowned in wine. And people are, we know that because Edward would make jokes about it later, and it was kind of in a way, George was such a drunk, he wanted to be drowned in wine, and I let him, that. So Edward would kind of joke about it later. I think it's even after he died, he was like, not George, such a character. So George is now gonzo. Isabel, his wife, is kind of in exile as well. She's married to a treasonous brother, so she's out of the picture. So Richard now enters the stage. Edward dies 5 years later. He dies at age, I want to say his late 30s. 40. So not bad for that time. He did okay. He died of just illness, right? Nothing crazy.
So when he dies, back then.
Just, you get scurvy, and as we all do. And when he died, his oldest son was only 12 years old. So his son is meant to be the King of England. Obviously not old enough to be King of England. So Richard, sweet Richard, steps forward, and he is named the Lord Protector. The Lord Protector role would be basically the person who's in charge of the king until the king comes of age. So he's the most powerful man in England because he is de facto the King of England until this son I believe his name is Edward too. I'll say Prince Edward. So Prince Edward is only 12. He will inherit the throne when he turns 18. So until that time, Richard is this Lord Protector. Richard, and this is where I was this feels very youngest sibling to me. He's never had the throne even kind of within his grasp. He has been so far down this list of the throne that it was Richard got to be nice to everybody because he was what am I going to do? I have to be nice to everybody because I am nowhere near the throne. Suddenly, all these things change. George is not in the picture. Edward has died. And he is so close to that throne because he is Lord Protector. I feel it starts to get to him a little bit, the power. He's really excited by this. So one of the first things he does as Lord Protector is he takes Edward's 2 oldest sons. One of them is also Prince Richard, so the same names as him and his brother, and puts them in the Tower of London. He says it's for their own safety because they need to be taken care of until Edward comes of age. But there's lots of evidence to prove that is otherwise, that he did it with bad intentions. Here's the aside about the princes in the tower. Have you ever heard about the princes in the tower?
No, it's not something that we discuss here on the streets.
Okay.
No.
Okay, no. BBC History Extra podcast has an entire series, a season on just the princes in the tower. And so I know what I personally think happened to them, but I'll tell you the basics and tell you what happened, because these two little boys, basically, I think they were 9 and 12 at the time. They're in a tower. The Tower of London was originally used as a residence, but as it goes on, it becomes a jail, a prison. So Richard putting them in the tower at all means they're under 24/7 watch, and it's not nice there. It's not like a castle. They're like cells. So the boys go missing, and nobody really knows what happened to them. Like, there's no definitive evidence either way. There's 3 ideas: that one, they just got sick and died while living in the tower because it wasn't good conditions. Richard requested that they be killed, or that they were smuggled out and left to France. Those are the 3 things that people were circulating at the time. What happened to them? But either way, they're not there. Let me look at my notes. 1674, they do find bones in the Tower of London that are of small children. And in 1933, they excavate those bones and take them out. They have not been DNA tested one way or the other, because Queen Elizabeth II, the one who just passed away, would not allow them to be tested. I do think they will be tested now under a new king, but
that's what your gut tells you.
That's what my
gut tells you.
I'm just listening to rumblings on the DNA circuit, and that's what I'm hearing. But there later on, while this is all happening, a man also comes from France and says that he is, like, years down the road, he comes from France and he's like, it's me, I'm Richard, the younger brother. We were smuggled into France. And nobody could remember what Richard even looked like. So they would bring people in and be like, is this Richard? His name was Percy Warbeck. And they'd bring him in and be like, is this your cousin Richard? And people would be like, I guess, like, I don't know. And so they ended up deciding it wasn't him, because then sorry.
So this kind of reminds me of us growing up. So something that should also be mentioned is that both our mother and father come from families of 8 siblings, right? So 8 and 8 on each side. And there would be like actual times when we were children and someone knocks, you're a motorcycle pulling the driveway, right? You're a knock at the door and someone shows up and it's like, it's me, your uncle. And you're like, okay, I have no idea. Dad, some guy's here who says he's your brother.
It happened more than I think people realize.
But really, like, there were actual instances where people showed up in the door and like, it's me, your uncle. And even at that time, we're talking about the 90s, where you're like, okay, I'll take your word for it because my dad's here and he can verify this person. Imagine going back to the 1600s, are we?
We're in the 1400s, actually.
Even worse! The 1400s!
So different.
The amount of technological advance.
The portrait techniques were completely different.
Yeah, so the 1400s, someone shows up and says, yep, I'm them. And people are like, but are you? Yes, I am. Okay.
Well, here's the thing. The idea of Richard, like, basically calling for the deaths of his own nephews was so horrifying. I think people really wanted to believe, A, they were still alive somewhere, and B, that Richard wasn't an absolutely horrible person, because up until now, he was pretty benign, I would say. And so the problem was, having them in the picture at all is a massive liability for Richard. No one takes any claim that he has to the throne seriously while Prince Edward and Prince Richard are still alive, because an army can be raised at any given time saying that they are the rightful heirs to the throne, no matter how old they are. So, word on the street is that, and what I believe is that Richard did order their deaths. So that's just what I'm saying. That's all. No judgment. No judgment for murdering nephews. I'm just saying that I do think Richard was up to it.
I'll judge him. Okay. That is not very nice. This is literally the worst thing. So this guy went, just to recap. So Richard went from being playing the middle, right? Being like, George, don't worry, Edward, don't worry. And then Edward's out of the picture. And then little Edward, Prince Edward, right? Mm-hmm. He's next in line. And now all of a sudden, Richard gets a little bit of a taste of what it could be like if he actually was on the throne, not just for his infant picture from Lord Warwick, but for real, for time and all eternity. And now he's kind of like, what is it? Gollum with the ring. Now it's his precious.
He does have his precious in grasp.
Okay, so that's the recap. Let's continue with this.
Okay, the next thing that Richard does, so people the princes are missing. People really don't know one way or the other what's happening. The next thing he does is push to have Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to Edward invalidated. Because if he has it invalidated, the children then are also out of the line of succession because they are no longer actual children under the law of Edward. He suddenly brings up this woman that Edward was pre-contracted to marry when he was a teenager. In England at that time, pre-contract was as pretty much as serious as a marriage. You would have had a ceremony, and it just meant you were engaged to be married. Usually they did it when people were too young to be married, like teenagers, like literally like 13 and 14-year-olds would be pre-contracted as a way to bring two households or countries together. And so Richard is like, by the way, like, whatever happened to that girl Edward was pre-contracted to? And people are like, what are you talking about? He's like, they really loved each other. Like, he doesn't even just say, like, it was for, like, legal purposes. He was like, Edward really liked her. Her name was Eleanor Talbot. And Richard really pushes this narrative that Edward was really in love with her. And, like, the Woodville marriage was very suspicious. And because of that, they do invalidate the marriage to Elizabeth. So they
that's
say
something
he was
that,
a bigamist.
So that's something that can happen. Somebody says, I don't think these two were actually, not that they weren't legally married, but that there was something that predated that, that invalidated that secondary. Okay.
So what Elizabeth Woodville basically does, that's when she had to like surrender her son. She has no other choice. She goes into sanctuary and takes the rest of her kids with her. She's just doing what she can at this point. She knows, like, the writing's on the wall. They're coming for me. I'm out of here. So Richard, because of this, the prince is missing. Elizabeth Woodville is now invalidated. They call, like, a tribunal, basically, of lords. And they're like, okay, I think Richard should be king. There's no king at this point because they have no one. So they basically nominate. They say Richard should be king. They request. And Richard is like, you guys, I'll do it.
Fine. If there's nobody else. Is there nobody else, really?
It's like looking.
Yeah.
So Richard becomes the King of England. And his wife, Warwick's daughter, is the Queen of England. And for a year, they live happily together. They go on progress throughout the country. I believe they started both King's College and Queen's College in Oxford as like the one thing they did together. And the problem is people are very uneasy about the way this has all gone down. Shockingly, no one like loves the idea that like two children have gone missing and one of them was the King of England.
Somebody has become invalidated. This whole thing seems
tales old as time. So Richard, I think, thinks he's more beloved than he really is when he's on really, really shaky ground. He is the last Plantagenet at this point, surviving male Plantagenet. And people just don't like the guy. And because of that, they kind of reach back in the archives of who possibly could take the throne. And there's this man called Henry Tudor that could inherit through his mother's side. It's not a great grasp on the throne, but it's like close enough. And he's a really great warrior. So he raises up an army. And like, as much as people dislike Richard, people love Henry Tudor so much. And at the last battle, I want to get the name of the battle right because I know people are just dying to know the name of the battle, which is the Battle of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth.
Is it really the Battle of Bosworth?
Mm-hmm. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I got that right.
Okay. Battle of Bosworth. If you take anything away from... No, I'm just kidding. So, in the Battle of Bosworth, according to accounts that I've read, Richard had 8,000 people in his army, and Henry only had 5,000. Henry murders them, kills them, wins. It's a Braveheart scenario. They win. No. Except that Braveheart died in the end. Richard was the Braveheart.
Whoa. We might have people who've never seen the movie.
Sorry.
Or might be halfway through it and push pause to come and listen to our podcast.
To be fair, it is a very long movie.
It is. It's like 7 hours.
I've been watching it for the last 30 years.
Well, quick little fact that I'm sure everybody wants to hear. I used to watch Braveheart every Sunday for like 2 years of my life. And obsessed about it so much that Jacqueline, you can validate this.
Absolutely.
I set our Windows 95 theme, which used to be able to do these themes for Windows 95, to Braveheart.
That's
and every time
a very old sentence that you just said.
Every time you minimized a window with the Windows 95 Braveheart theme, the voice would go, "You've dropped your rock."
That sounds just like it. Do you know why? Because it's seared in my brain forever. I think it's such a bizarre thing.
I was in control of the themes for Windows 95 in our household, and I was obsessed with Braveheart.
Yeah, I think you were pretty much the only person who knew how to use a computer, which still stands to this day.
If only people could have seen the hoopla that happened before the podcast actually started, they would all understand exactly what we're dealing with. Anyways, back to the story.
I took my notes on paper, Ryan.
Which made me sweat. Once you lifted the notebook, I'm like, there are multiple devices with so many apps. So many different apps.
I don't like it.
You could have written on a digital device and have it. Anyways, whatever.
It's not the same. It's not the same. And I couldn't tell you about the Battle of Bosworth had I not written it down with my own writing. So, Battle of Bosworth. One account says that they saw, feels like very Regina George. Remember at the end of Mean Girls when they're like, some people said they saw her head go all the way around. Someone said they saw he got hit so hard in the head that his helmet went through his skull. And it's like very like, I saw Richard's helmet go right through his skull.
Did you know?
And then
Did you hear?
Another historian, which made me laugh like out loud when I was writing notes. I have to get the quote right too. They said, Richard died alone. He was killed fighting manfully. And the word manfully, use it in a sentence today, everybody. Manfully. While Richard, according to his historian, died manfully, he still died, right? That's the moral of the story. You can be the manliest man of all time. If your helmet goes through your skull, you're dead. Dead still.
You died a manful death.
You died a manful death, but you're dead. Richard's body goes missing for truly hundreds of years, and they only discovered it in 2012 under a parking garage. You didn't hear this in 2012?
No.
So they did find his bones eventually. They were under a parking garage. Shocker.
Oh my gosh. You need to tell me.
He died manfully, but he was still under a parking garage too. So that was it. Plantagenets are gonzo, dunzo. Henry Tudor, not only does he then come back to England, takes the throne, he marries Edward's daughter, who is Richard's niece. So he takes the throne from the Plantagenet, marries into their family, and is like, goodbye. Henry Tudor then is the grandfather and great-grandfather all the way down to Elizabeth I until the end of the Tudor dynasty.
That is wild. Really and truly, that's wild.
It's a wild story. It's very dramatic. And like you said, it just like, I find sibling relationships fascinating anyway. I just think it's interesting the way people can be raised the exact same way. And then their similarities and their differences are so interesting to me after the fact, right? They become these adults and having these three boys and in their birth order grew up expecting different things from the throne. Like Edward knew he was always going to have it. George always wanted it. Richard didn't expect it. And they all, because of that, made decisions accordingly.
And you know what I find fascinating? Is that these stories exist, and I watch lots of movies, and I think I read a decent amount of books. I had no idea that this was it. And every time I hear one of these stories, I'm like, why doesn't someone make a movie about this? I'm sure there are multiple movies made about it. I'm here like, why? Why has no one told me this before? But really, it's absolutely crazy that this unfolded from 12 siblings.
I'm actually, it started with a love of like just the Tudors. I'm actually more interested in the Tudors, but the Plantagenet as siblings, that whole story is so interesting to me. But when I went to England, I went to the palace, Windsor. Windsor is where Henry VIII is buried. And I remember like standing over his grave and feeling like, you know, when you see like a famous person in real life and you're like, that person is a like a real person. Like, this is blowing my mind. It's like watching a dog walk on its hind legs. Like, I shouldn't be seeing this with my eyes. And that's how I felt standing over the grave of Henry VIII. I was just like, this is my Oscars. This is my walk of this is my Hollywood Walk of Fame.
It's amazing that they became part of your story, right? That you're like,
and we're talking about it now, and
it's now about you and where you were standing above this grave, and it is
my favorite thing to pull out at like a dinner party or when I'm around people I don't know very well. I'm like, have you ever heard about the Plantagenet siblings?
It's absolutely wild. Yeah, it really is truly wild that, again, like you said, you've got these 3 siblings. They're born, raised in a very similar fashion in the same time period, and they all end up being very different, very different. But I do now see why you said that Richard gave off the younger brother energy, because there is kind of like each one that there's always like just a little bit more entitlement as you go down. Like, I feel more entitled to things than maybe our older brother, and I'm guessing you feel more, and that just kind of like cascades. And I guess as you get down to the bottom, when you learn of certain things. But then I think there's also something weird that happens, that when the older ones learn about the entitlement and what the other ones got, then there is also like, what? You let them do what? And so I wish we could see how that played out, but obviously everybody died. So
everybody died in a violent fashion. Also, I was thinking
George didn't. George
went out.
George just got to retire into a vat of wine and become a great dinner story from then forward. Anyway, that was a wonderful, wonderful recounting of the Plantagenets, which is
Porters.
how they're known. The Porters. So the Porters. It was a wonderful, wonderful recounting of the Plantagenets.
Plantagenets.
Well, Plantagenets.
There
The
you
good
go.
news is they're not around to hear me butchering their name, because they themselves were butchered. Ha 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 ha.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to say it. They did do DNA testing on Richard's body that they found, and did find that he was related to a famous opera singer.
Really?
So they're still around. Just saying.
Okay, well, I take it back. Then I take it back. I take it back because they're listening for sure.
They're gonna see this in the show notes, and they're gonna know.
Their Google alerts. They're gonna get a Google alert from the podcast and be like, "The what? The Dreyer Drive? The Dreyer Drive podcast?
Honey, wake up! A new Plantagenet podcast just dropped."
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to say thank you to everybody who's listened. So the 2 people that are actually listening to this right now. We are, yes, and one of you is mom, the other is dad. You're on separate devices.
No. They're on separate devices in the same room.
In the same,
both at full volume.
And I have no idea that the other's listening to it. Yeah, there are different places in the podcast. All right.
My dad's toggling between this and old audition tapes from America's Got Talent.
While screenshotting both.
Okay, really quick, before we go, I just would like to show you a text that Dad sent me today, not 5 hours ago.
I like this.
Said, thought you might like these. Had surprised someone waited so long to design this kind of shoe. $1 billion industry just waiting. And it's a pair of high heels with wheels on them like a car.
That is amazing. So for those who can't see this, they are high heels where the toe part of the high heel has car wheels and looks like the front end of a sports car with a 6-inch heel on the back, like a regular heel. So you guys, anyone who wants to take over that $1 billion industry, just waiting to be uncovered.
You know what that is? That is a manful man trying to connect with his daughter.
Manfully.
In Utah. Manfully.
All right. So on that note, thank you for everyone who's listening. This is really corny to even say, but I want to get in the habit of saying this. It does help fresh, new, young podcasts when people subscribe and leave comments. I'm sorry for doing that, but I've got to do it. So subscribe to this, leave your comment, and I look forward to sharing some stories about siblings in the next one.
Oh, I got more. I got them locked and loaded. My notebook is hot from the pen.
Well, I will be over here waiting manfully.